Okay, welcome to Biology Module 15, Part 2. As usual, if you have any questions, you can contact me at Mr. C at mrcscience.com. We're getting into the second part of Module 15. If you should have your books and have it handy. Go ahead and turn to page 476, and there's a better picture than what I've drawn down here for you. But this should be review for a lot of you, but we're going to go through basic parts of the flower here. So we're talking about, last week we talked about asexual reproduction or vegetative reproduction in plants. Now we're getting into sexual reproduction specifically in what's called angiosperms. Angiosperms are flowering plants. Basically two main types of plants. I can't spell here. Two main types of plants, angiosperms and gymnosperms. Angiosperms have flowers for reproduction, gymnosperms do not. Okay, so go ahead and turn to page 476. And you'll see a picture of a flower there like I've got in front of you. So basic parts, first thing is, here, let's change our color. First thing is, most flowers have both male and female components. So if I change my text here, so the female portion in the center of the flower is called the pistil, also known as the carpel. So one of those two, pistil or carpel, that is the female. It has three parts. It's got the style, or the stigma up top. This portion right here is the stigma. That's where pollen lands on. It's kind of sticky. The pollen can adhere to it. Then the pollen will send a pollen tube down the style, work its way around and into the ovary of the plant. Ovary is this area down here. Ovary has small ovules, which will become individual seeds once they are fertilized. We'll go into that a little more in detail in a little bit. The male part of the plant are these little pieces right here. Those pieces right there are known as stamen. Stamen are composed of two parts. The anther, which produces and holds the pollen, and then the style. Or not the style, the filament, sorry. I can't write. The filament is just a long stalk to get the anther up and out. So flowers are pollinated a number of different ways. Wind, insects, birds, things like that will transfer pollen from one anther to another pistil or carpel. It can be the same flower, it can be different flowers. Okay, other parts you know in here, let's go back to our black petals. Under the petals are small, what almost look like small petals, but these are called sepals. Sepals are not on every flower. Some have them, some don't. Underneath that is a receptacle, which is kind of the base. And then the pedicel, which is also known as the stem in this case. Oh, pedicel. Okay, so these are the basic parts of the flower. Guess what you might see on your test or your study guide is knowing the anatomy of this. It gets a little more complex than this though. So now we find out that there are different types of flowers. Two of the possible types are whoops, let's move that, are perfect and imperfect. Perfect flower has both carpel and stamen. So both male and female organelles. Imperfect has either carpel or stamen. So in this case, the flower can be male if it's stamen or female if it's carpels. Another type of flower that they have in there besides perfect and imperfect is called composite. Composite should sound familiar. It's a term used all over the place. It means combined. So there's multiple flowers in a composite flower. Perhaps the most famous one is the sunflower. If you've seen a sunflower, or you can look at pictures online or in the book, sunflower is actually not one flower. Sunflower has the center where all the seeds grow. Each seed comes from one flower. So there's lots of flowers in the center. So each seed will be one flower. And then you may say, well, is a sunflower a monocot or a dicot? Leaves of pairs of groupings of 3 or 4s or 5s. You can't tell because each one of these yellow petals on the outside of the sunflower is also flowers. So all the center is a bunch of flowers, the outsides are a bunch of flowers. It is a composite flower that grows lots of, or makes one large flower. So the petals on the outside are just petals. They're made for petals. They don't actually reproduce. The flowers in the center reproduce. Okay, so let's get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts. Go ahead and turn to page 480. And this will look a little familiar for you because we're going to talk about meiosis. You're familiar with meiosis. Meiosis is dividing of cells to produce gametes. And we've talked about this in the animal world. Now we're going to talk about it in the plants. So on page 480, figure 15.7, you'll see there you have pollen sacs in there. Pollen starts as a diploid cell. Diploid means a pair of chromosomes, so there are 2N. That diploid cell goes through meiosis. And you'll remember from meiosis you end up with 4 haploid cells, or just half one chromosome, not a duplicated chromosome. And then those haploid cells go through mitosis so that they can duplicate themselves to have a tube cell and a sperm cell. The sperm cell you're familiar with, it's a male gamete. The tube cell we'll show in a little bit is the cell that produces a tube that travels down the carpel style and works its way down to the ovary. So, okay, on page 481 you see embryo sac formation. So in here you've got the ovary, and inside of those it shows you a picture of just a single ovule. The ovule is a bunch of cells. I can kind of draw it here. The picture in the book looks better. Bunch of cells surrounding a single cell. That single cell starts out as a diploid cell, so it means it has its duplicated chromosomes. It goes through meiosis, and much like animal meiosis, it produces one viable egg, and then it produces 3 polar bodies. Remember those polar bodies, that's an L. Those polar bodies have the same genetic material as the egg, but they don't have all the cellular material. So they're small, too small to be viable. What happens then is the single cell, called a megaspore here, which is now haploid because it's gone through meiosis, so it's just an N. It goes through mitosis to produce 2 haploid cells, and then more mitosis to produce 8 haploid cells. So it's 8 haploid cells through mitosis. And then those cells differentiate. You've got 2 large haploid cells in the center with the nucleus, and then you've got the 6 outer cells formed in what's now called the embryo sac. So that kind of looks familiar. Male, you start with a haploid, you get 4 diploid, or start with a diploid, you get 4 haploid. Female, you start with a diploid, you get 4 haploid, but only 1 is viable as an egg. And then it does some different things with dividing and becoming what's going to be set up as a seed. So then pollination comes. Turn to page 484. On page 484, you'll see pollination. So the pollen grains land on the style at the top. Then that tube nucleus, here, let me draw. Then that, here's our carpel. Whoa, it's got a funky style. Here's our ovule down here, or ovary. So the pollen lands on top. Then that tube nucleus makes a tube. Runs down to the bottom of the ovary and enters the ovary. Following that tube nucleus is the sperm cells. Now what's interesting about that is the sperm cells travel down. There's only 1 cell in the pollen grain, but mitosis occurs inside of the tube nucleus, and now you have 2 pollen grains, or 2 haploid cells, 2 sperm. They run up into the ovule, and remember you have that embryo sac, and inside there you got 6 cells, but you got a single cell with 2 nucleus, or 2 nuclei. So those sperm cells come up and attach to that nuclei. It's called double fertilization. The 2 cells come together. Go ahead and look on page 485, right next door. One of those nucleus, so here's a corn cell. Well, let's look at a corn. Let's say this is corn, although corn looks a little bit different. So what's kind of interesting about corn is you got your embryo. So one of those nuclei become the embryo. The other nuclei become what's called the cotyledon, or the food source for the embryo. So the other one becomes the food source. And remember our monocot and dicot. Mono, 1 cotyledon, a corn. Dicot, 2 cotyledons, like the pea plant. Shows a kind of a cross section of a corn on the left, a monocot, and opened up a dicot seed on the other side. So that becomes the seed. And then that seed goes through a germination process once it's buried and receives water, things like that. So if you turn to page 489, you'll see that germination process shows there. The embryo starts growing. It produces what's called a radicle, which will eventually become the roots of the plant. At least the tip of it will. Then as the radicle grows, it starts pushing up as well and pulling that seed out. The radicle that exits the soil will become the stem. Those cotyledons are used up, so they supply food as it develops. It gives it enough to get it going, get it out of the soil, and produce its first leaves, so it can start growing. So that gives you a good idea what's going on here. They talk a little bit about fruits. Fruits are kind of interesting. We got some time, we can go over fruits. Okay, fruits. What's interesting about fruits is fruits are usually the ovary of the plant, or of the flower. So the seeds develop inside the ovary, becomes a fruit. Fruits are primarily for seed dispersal. An animal finds the fruit, eats it, carries it away, disperses the seeds away from the plant. So different types of fruits. Let's talk about a couple different ones. Simple fruits. Simple fruits versus compound fruits. Simple versus compound. Simple fruit, single ovary. So one ovary becomes one fruit. Example of this, blueberry, apple, cherry, things like that. Okay, compound fruit formed from many ovaries. Example of this, raspberry, and believe it or not, strawberry. Okay. There are two different types of compound fruits. One is called multiple, and one is called aggregate. Okay. Multiple fruits, multiple ovaries, but you can tell they're multiple. A raspberry is an idea of a multiple fruit. You see lots of little fruits all stuck together to form your raspberry. An aggregate fruit, strawberry. If you ever looked at a strawberry, it's got lots of seeds all over it. Well, each one of those seeds came from a single ovary. And as the strawberry ripened and matured, the ovaries grew together to make what's called an aggregate fruit. Another example of that is pineapple. Pineapple is a similar type of fruit. Okay. So our simple fruits, so these are compound fruits, can become compound or aggregate. Our simple fruits, oh, I'm running out of space. I have to erase stuff. Delete. There we go. Okay. Our simple fruits can be classified a bunch of different ways. The first two main classifications are, fleshy and dry. Fleshy and dry fruit. Fleshy fruits are like apples, tomatoes, cucumbers, things like that. You can tell they're fleshy. Dry fruits, on the other hand, are your nuts and grains. So fleshy is what we really think about fruits, so let's say apples. Dry fruits, nuts, grains. Not as obvious there. Fleshy fruits have a bunch of different ways we can classify them. Palms, drupes, berries, and modified berries. Okay. Drupes, palms. Palms have the fleshy part of the fruit is not formed from the ovary, but instead comes from the pedicel. Remember the base of the flower? Here's your flower right here. The pedicel is this big part right down here. The ovary forms a leathery covering around the fleshy tissue. Palm, if you know French at all, is French for apple. Apples, if you've eaten one, you've gotten down to the core, it's kind of plasticky. It's got that leathery inside to it. Okay. Apples and pears are an example of that. If the ovary itself develops the fleshy tissue of the fruit, there are two possible structures for the fruit. If the ovary forms a hard covering around the seed, then it's called a drupe. An example of a drupe would be like a peach. A peach has a very tough outer covering. A peach, an avocado, things like that. Olives are another one. currently called a pit. Okay. If the ovary doesn't form a hard covering around the seed, but instead simply encloses the seed in fleshy tissue, it forms a berry. Berries are kind of interesting because berries are known for having kind of a thin covering on the outside, multiple fruit inside. All from the ovary, you can see you get multiple seeds inside because it doesn't develop from one ovule. It has all of them, and it's the ovary. Example of a berry, kind of funny. Blueberry is an example of a berry. Something you don't think of it as a berry is a tomato. Tomato is a berry. Don't know if there's an E on the end or not. Okay. Nuts and dries. You got your pods. Most obvious one of this is the pea pod. Multiple grains or nuts or fruit inside of the pea pod. Splits along one side. Beans are an example of that, like I said. Peanuts are an example of a pea pod, or a pod, even though they don't have a fleshy pod like that. If the ovary has many chambers, each of which contain many seeds, we call those capsules. Capsule. I forgot the S. Capsules. Okay. Poppy seeds, I'm trying to think if there's a decent one that you know right offhand. Kind of an interesting one that you are familiar with and may not even known about is the Samara. Samara are winged. Maple seeds. We call them helicopters. Those wings serve to help with dispersal. And finally, the one we're most familiar with is a nut. Nut has a hard outer covering encasing the outside of the seed, and there's no fruit around that. So, okay, that kind of covers what we want to cover here. Again, if you have any questions, don't be afraid to email me at mrc@mrcscience.com. Thanks.